where you put yourself matters. As you can probably tell from many of the stories that I tell in my sermons, I've spent a lot of my life and time in and around the mountains, right? I grew up in the mountains outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and though I spent some years living away from any, I was constantly finding the time to, in different ways, to put myself back in them so I could go backpacking or mountain biking or kayaking or rock climbing. So coming here to live in Roanoke has seemed like a very natural fit for Andrea and I. I do love the beach too, for you beach people out there, but the mountains have always held a special place in my heart, at least. And really, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that for me, mountains make me somewhat feel above the ordinary, right? Make me feel closer to God. A few years ago, my brother and my dad and I went on a backpacking trip in Colorado, and a few days out into our trip, we found ourselves high up on this mountain right on the Continental Divide, literally in the middle of nowhere. We were days from any towns or roads. We were camping at 12,000 feet that night, way above where there were any trees, and it was cold, and I mean really, really cold, and it was hard to sleep because of the altitude. So at 1 a.m. when I hear my brother call out to me to come outside of the tent so that he can show me something, my first thought was, no, actually. And my second thought, when I put my arm out of my sleeping bag, was, no, you're crazy, and it's cold out, and unless there's a bear out there, tap dancing and juggling, all right, I'm not getting out of this sleeping bag or this tent. He did eventually, with much coaxing, get me out there, and man, am I glad he did, actually. Because when I stepped out of that tent, I immediately looked up at the stars, and I was completely blown away. I'd seen stars, obviously, but I had never seen anything like that. And there were so many stars, it was like a blanket of them had suddenly just been draped over top of me. They were so close. I felt like I could reach out and just kind of touch them with my hands. And framed in by the high peaks underneath them, it was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, a wonderful mountaintop experience. And I was totally awed by the power and the beauty of creation, and I felt incredibly close in that moment to God. Now maybe like me, you too think of hiking and camping here in the Appalachians or somewhere out in the Rockies as, a mountaintop experience. And they are that in a very narrow and somewhat literal way. But we also hear that term mountaintop experience used to explain an experience that transforms someone in some way. Possibly when they come to see or understand something for the first time or in a whole new way. And a mountaintop experience like that one, it requires more than just a higher elevation or getting away from the ordinary. I tend to think of those mountaintop experiences like that require, they're more about two things. Those mountaintop experiences will often be spiritual and be visionary. Last week in his sermon, Eric mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., which reminded me of the last speech that Dr. King gave on April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, where he famously said, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. It was 5 years before that speech where he gave his most famous speech, where Dr. King spoke about his dream that one day the sons and daughters of former slaves and the sons and daughters of former slave owners would be able to sit down together at a table of brother and sisterhood, a dream that his children would one day live in a nation where they would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, of course, Dr. King never lived to see his dream come true, because on April 4th, 1968, the day after he talked about going to that mountaintop in his speech, his life was cut short when he was killed by someone who was scared of his dream. which made what Dr. King said just the day before even that much more powerful. I have been to the mountaintop, he said. I have seen the promised land. And those words, they recall the story of Moses, who had led the Israelites right to the threshold of the promised land. And while they were camped there on the east side of the Jordan River, Moses climbed the mountain, Mount Nebo, to the top. And from there, he could look not just across the Jordan Valley, but all the way over to the promised land, to the land where Abraham and God's people had been promised that they would someday go. But Moses only got to see it from a distance because he died there. He was buried on Mount Nebo without ever stepping foot in that promised land that his people would someday call their own. With Moses and Martin Luther King, they had mountaintop experiences, one physical, one figurative, but for both, it was spiritual and it was visionary. Now, it was spiritual because it was based on the presence and the promise of God with them. And it was visionary because it allowed them to see something that was not yet. It gave them a glimpse of the future. And that was the same kind of mountaintop experience that Peter and James and John had that day on their own Mount Tabor. Now, from high up on that mountain where they had gone with Jesus, they were able to look from there not only out across the Jezreel Valley, but also across the Valley of Time. And there on that mountain, they caught a glimpse of Jesus in all of his future glory. On that mountain, in the events that transpired in our gospel text that you heard, the past and the future collapsed into the present. Disciples saw James and Jesus with Moses and Elijah, who represented the great prophets and teachings of the past. But they also saw how Jesus would appear in the future at the end of time. It was spiritual and it was visionary. It was a moment filled with the power and the glory of God's presence, and it was a moment that transported them beyond time to see the future. And obviously for them, for those disciples, it was a powerful experience because it would be that vision, it would be that experience that would give the disciples the strength and the courage they would need, the perseverance and the hope to carry them through their lifetimes of ministry. Lives that would also include being accused of things and persecuted, and two of them put to death for their faith in Jesus. Years later even, John would write about how it was that transfiguration experience up on that mountain that was the pivotal moment in his life and in his faith. And really, who wouldn't want such a mountaintop experience, right? Who of us here today, who wouldn't benefit from experiencing the power and the glory of God's presence in such a way that it would enable us to live our day-to-day lives with courage, with strength, with vision, and with hope for the future? We all would want that. We all need that. Because let's be honest, in life, it isn't easy. And being a person of faith who does their best to follow the ways of Jesus in this world, it isn't easy. In fact, in some ways, it seems to actually be getting harder. So yeah, we would all love to have an experience like that because we need that courage and strength. We need that vision and hope. We need those things in our lives. And so the question then for us is, well, okay, so how can that happen? Can we make that happen? There's a pretty good chance, I'll be honest, that none of us are going to have an experience like Peter, James, and John did that day on the Mount of Transfiguration, right? And so then how does this happen for us? Well, the truth is, God can give us a mountaintop experience whenever or wherever he chooses to. In the Chick-fil-A drive-thru line, if that was it, I'm definitely not limiting God. But what I want to suggest to you today is that if we do want that mountaintop experience in our lives, then I think we need to be proactive about it. And what I mean by that is this, is that if we want to catch a glimpse of Jesus in all his glory, if we want to be transformed by the presence of God into people who are able to faithfully follow Jesus with their lives, if we want a vision of how someday God will remake this messed up world into what it should be, and then be strengthened and encouraged by that vision so that we can then live it out in our day-to-day lives, well, then this may sound very simple, but the biggest way we can actually do that is just by putting ourselves in places so that that can happen. Because where you put yourself matters. So yes, of course, put yourself in worship as often as you can, but also put yourself in journey groups or faith formation class. Put yourself in a fellowship group or in a music group. Put yourself tutoring at CYP. Put yourself sitting at a table up at the lighthouse with a homeless family who's here for Family Promise. Put yourself in a red hairnet that makes you look like Ronald McDonald, right? And at a Rise Against Hunger event. Put yourself at the Shrove Tuesday supper. Pretend you're young. Do pancake races. Try not to pull muscles in the process. Put yourself at the Bradley Free Clinic or at a Habitat for Humanity site. Put yourself visiting someone who's sick or who can no longer leave their home. Put yourself in the rescue mission or on the front step of someone's house who's new to Roanoke and has no friends here. Put yourself at Highland Park Elementary at the Student Talent Show, which is what I did last week, and see kids of all colors and backgrounds laughing and hugging and cheering for each other. In other words, put yourself in meaningful places. Put yourself in meaningful places, and you will be shocked by how God will shake you and he will shape you. And how your vision for this world and for your life will absolutely change. We can go through months of our lives, weeks, days of our lives, getting stuck in the same places and the same routines with the same people. All of the places that we're supposed to go, all the people we're supposed to be with. And yes, I know that that's part of life, and yeah, we just have to do it. I know that. But when we do just that, then think about all of the things that we are missing out on. Years ago, the synod or the diocese I was a part of had a sister diocese in very rural Brazil where a member of our church had gone to be a missionary. And my bishop at the time asked me to take 10 days and lead a Habitat for Humanity global village project to build a kind of a community building there, which would be used like many of those buildings are in these rural areas as a medical shelter, a school, a church, and anything else you can imagine. And as I was assembling the group to go, a man from my congregation who I rarely saw and who wasn't very involved in church or anywhere really, he showed up at my office one day and he says to me, for some reason, David, I think I should go on this mission trip. Right? Now I'll be honest, I was kind of surprised by this and yeah, a bit skeptical. He seemed like the last person who would be standing there signing up, to be honest. Mission trips are big commitments. It takes time and energy to prepare and go, and it takes money that you can use in your life many other ways. It takes time off from work or from wherever else in your life that you do. And I somewhat gently reminded him of this. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, but he did stay with his commitment to go. And what a week it was for him. He was overwhelmed at first by the sights and the sounds and, yes, the smells of the extreme poverty and need of that place. But that's natural when we're forced out of our bubbles and into the reality of how so many of the people in our world actually live. The experience, it challenged him. It hurt him. It moved him. And he loved it, right? At the end of the week, we were having our nightly group time on the roof of the place where we were staying because with no AC, it was the coolest place there was. And he stood in front of the group, and he had tears streaming down his face, and he told us of what that week had done for him and done to him. You see, he had had his own mountaintop experience on that roof, you see. It was spiritual, and God was present, and it was visionary. He told us that for the first time in his life, he could understand what God wanted for him and from him. He had a vision of how he would live his life and how he wanted to spend his time. And the thing was, he actually came back and lived that vision out. Now, I'm not going to say, oh yeah, he was in church every single Sunday. He tithed 50%. He served on 10 different committees. He brought fresh baked bread to the priest every single week, right? I mean, that would be a great moral of the story, but that's not the moral of the story. But I could see a difference. Here's the difference I could see. I could see a difference in where he put himself, all right? Because when he got back, he was in worship, okay, worship's good. He was active, serving in the community and at church, and he never missed another mission trip, that's for sure. Because you see, he had gotten a vision, and he was a man transformed. Where you put yourself does matter. And so the question I want you to ask yourself when you leave this place today is, where will you put yourself? Well, wherever it is, I hope and pray that it is spiritual and that it is visionary. And that God will use that experience to transform you and then to use you to realize his dream and his vision for this world. Amen.